welcome to Excavations, a series on Varn blog. And we keep digging into this Hal Draper article. We're starting with uh, a not as famous Hal Draper article. I mean, everyone goes over Anatomy of a Microsect. A lot of people go over the dictatorship of the proletariat from Marx Lenin. But this one, just a reminder, since we are now 4 episodes in and maybe 6 pages into the essay. If you've forgotten why we started talking about this, this is called the inevitability of socialism, ? The meaning of a much abused formula from 1947. And it starts with the idea of the inevitability of socialism and the questions that arose around that in the early middle of the 20th century. And I think it's interesting to talk about now because this question is both everywhere and also forgotten.
That's interesting.
Well, I mean, like, who actually argues that socialism is inevitable in a kind of mechanistic way anymore? Like, nobody. Even the most Soviet cosplayer does not actually do that anymore.
Sure.
And, the reasons why is basically the 40s and the 50s themselves, right? Like, and we are, 3 generations out from that now. But I think this is an interesting essay because it kind of gets to the problems of the question in the first place. Like, there's just problems with a lot of these ideas, and while Draper doesn't want to completely drop them, he does point out problems. And I'm actually, when we get to this section called the limitations of Marxist formulas, I'm actually going to I think Draper makes a stronger argument than he actually admits he makes for, like, maybe not taking any of the formulas all that seriously.
Oh yeah, there's a real zinger stuck in there.
But let's get into the essay. We are on section the limitations of Marxist formulas. They're not numbered, but
we're on inevitability and certainty, actually. That's the one right before that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Last time we spoke about Hook, Sidney Hook.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just after that where he brings up the morality of accepting the inevitability or desire for socialism.
Right.
Okay.
So this is Draper. The concept of inevitability is closely bound up semantically with the concept of certainty. Now, just as we saw, there was both an objective and a human subjective moment aspect to the first question. There is it also with certainty. Consider the statements: 1, it is certain to fail, and 2, I am certain it will fail. These 2 statements may carry different implications. The first has a connotation that the proposition is objectively provable. The second has a connotation that I am morally convinced of this but cannot prove it. As in the case where the disputant, fresh out of argument, stamps his foot and says, I am certain I'm right. Thus, the words inevitable and certain may tend to fuse their objective and human subjective moments, or if you wish to confuse them. There's a tendency for the word inevitable to be used in contexts which give it the connotation neither of a predetermined fate nor of an assigned degree of probability, but rather merely the connotation of asserting high confidence and conviction. In Marxist literature, we meet this element especially in agitational passages or perorations.
Perorations. This is a word that I had to look up. I didn't know what that it meant. Peroration. It's like the final part of an oratory speech where you're trying to rile people up.
Ironically, since this is a word from oratory, I have read it, but never said it.
There you go. another word right now that I had to look up as well, which, I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, but we might call it the hortatory use of the word. It was like horticulture? No, hortatory, like the word exhort.
Yeah. It is interesting that the Communist Manifesto first passage begins with historical analysis of the alternatives of revolutionary reconstitution are common ruin, but it ends in the brilliant peroration climaxed by its brackets the bourgeoisie's fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. The logical purist might object to the expression equally inevitable makes as much sense as equally dead. But he would be making the mistake of believing that Marx and Engels are trying to write with philosophic rigor, which I do actually take because there's a difference in style when Marx is trying to write with philosophical rigor or with analytical rigor
Sure.
than when he's writing in the manifesto or in the political works. Read Capital versus the manifesto. Like there's flourishes in Capital, but like unless you're really trying to be rigorous, you're not like defining yards of linen.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who say that capital was meant to be sort of understood and read by the common man, and that a lot of people would have the
Yeah,
intellectual
it has
ability to break it
untranslated
down.
Greek in it.
So yeah, maybe not, but the Communist Manifesto obviously served a totally different purpose. You can tell by the way that it's written and how, short it is comparatively and all of that. But like I think there's another really interesting point here before we circle back into the semantics that he's bringing up, which is that just trying to write with philosophical rigor, something that has come up on a number of occasions in our Kohei Saito readings, is about
It's Kohei
Marx's
Saito. Apparently, I
Saito.
finally got somebody who knew how to say Japanese. Pronounce it for me.
Aha, Ken, that makes sense. Yeah, Saito,
All right.
Saito, Saito. Anyway, the kind of putting into context Marx's split with the young Hegelians and moving away from philosophical concepts and his previous understandings and into something a little bit different, more political, economical, maybe like moving into a different aspect of historical materialism and away from previous Hegelian understanding, and even just like well, we talk about Althusser and all of that as well. So
Bullshit.
yeah.
No. One of the things I'll say though, Marxism, and this is not just in these formulas, but Marxism in general is given to try to collapse the normative and descriptive. And I will admit, you kind of can't totally separate the normative and descriptive,
Mm-hmm.
but what what Marxism tries to do as a kind of argument, or what Marx and Engels try to do it, Engels more so than Marx, but they both do it, is try to remove values or subjective arguments from the case and to make the argument that their process is a kind of logic that is approximate to what we might mean by scientific. Now they use the word Wissenschaft, which means kind of science, but it also means logic. It means a lot of stuff. But they are definitely asserting that like our political argument is not just morally correct; it is objectively the most likely outcome. And so that I do think that's a problem. All right, and I do think one of the things that we have to admit here is that Draper's having to do a little bit of work to say that like Marx and Engels don't mean exactly what they say. Like,
Curious. That's definitely one way of looking at it. I think he's also like really addressing the normative on its own. Look at how it keeps inserting moral and morally into the last couple of
mm,
passages that we're reading. This kind of like consideration of
yeah,
righteousness, versus the descriptive factors, even just semantically of what these words mean. The difference between what we say and mean ourselves when we use them. So yeah, there is a bit of work going into that. It's really interesting, actually.
It's interesting to me because this is not from Wittgensteinian philosophy in any way, but Draper's actually kind of going to similar places, it being like, look, we know what we mean when we say this with philosophical rigor, but we also know what this means in common usage, and it has different meanings in common usage. Grow up and
Yeah.
realize that not everything is stated with like absolute philosophical rigor. And I think that's actually a fair point. And I think it's a defensible point. The problem that you have though with Marxism are with when we get to like Marxist formulas is that a lot of them really were stated as rules and they don't really
Mm-hmm.
work as rules.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll have to get into that. Anyway, back into this. I think this is I like the fact that he goes into a rhetorical analysis here, though, because the manifesto is a rhetorical work. It has analysis in it. It also has a program in the middle of it that's like not relevant anymore. People like
Right.
to talk about it, and it's not the program actually adopted by the Communist League. It's the one that was voted on that Marx liked, and they put it in the manifesto. But the one that the Communist League actually agreed to is not the same. Yeah, it's kind of funny. Um, so
What about Trotsky though? Because like, I think he's a little bit more blatant and then just trying to use rhetorical devices, and he's a little bit more honest when he's discussing these things. There does get to that point where he's like, we can't be so pessimistic or fatalistic about these things, but like we have to actually look at
yeah, but
historical alternatives in an honest way.
I'm gonna have to like point out that basically though what Draper says here is Marx's formulas aren't really anything. I mean, he doesn't actually go that far. And one of the reasons why he defends the inevitability of socialism claim against the Marxist formula claim, because he actually doesn't really think it is a Marxist formula. We'll get to that. But
Mm-hmm.
he talks about how a lot like if you look at the actions of what these people do, that a lot of the formulas have overriding principles that undo them, and it makes a lot of what people do very. I mean, I hate to say it, but it makes a lot of these Marxist formulas like that, like the answer to the national question or this, that, or the other, kind of meaningless.
Hmm.
Because if you look at what people did in practice, they are wildly not consistent. And what Trotsky kind of admits is like, yeah, we're wildly not consistent because the overarching, like what I would call an orientation, trumps a specific formula for its manifestation. Are like what I would mean, like it's basically like we know the spirit of the rule, we have these rules, but the spirit of the rule is going to guide it. The problem that you get, where we're going to get into in the next section, though, is it really means that like none of these like formulas actually have any real applicability or predictability. They are not scientific. They're kind of
Mm-hmm.
ad hoc rationalizations.
Right. Well, inevitable is not really scientific in the same way that certain is
Right.
either, right? Like I looked up at the etymology of a lot of these words, because if we're going to play with semantics, then you might as well get
Go
all
ahead.
of
Go
the
on
ducks in
semantics.
order. So inevitable, both of these come from Latin, but inevitable means unavoidable.
Right.
Um, and certain, also from Latin, means like sure, for one thing, and just like highly probable without any doubt, more or less.
Right.
So, the way that we use certain, yeah, I'm certain of it, you're making a statement about yourself, but certain is already fixed. It's a fixed end.
Right.
Unavoidable is going to happen with some eventuality, but it's a little bit more open-ended. So we can use them interchangeably in a semantic sort of colloquial sense, but that changes over time as well. And then he goes on to say, I loved this part, that we fuse them or maybe confuse them. And confuse also has its own interesting etymology, like the past participle is much older than the verb itself, like I'm confusing you. Confuse comes from confusus, which really means to confound, and the like base root of it is ruin. Just you screwing things up. You're erroneously regarding as identical, rendering something indistinguishable. So he's doing some really fun wordplay here just by saying that we're confusing inevitability and certainty in and of itself. Now we need to start picking that apart. So let's keep reading.
Right. The fact that it is practically impossible to use language without leaving much unexpressed and quote, understood, the quotations in the text, not mine.
Mhm.
This to use an example I did not have the felicity to invent.
This is so silly. That's like such a little incel dig when you read the rest of this part. I didn't have the felicity to invent.
If a young man phones his girl and asks, is anyone home right now? And she says no, and he says, then I'll be right over. It is easy to point out that the question is nonsense and the answer is wrong, since that man knew all the time that there was someone home, namely the girl he was talking to.
It sounds like a phone prank, but also like I've never called the girl and she said, come over kind of thing.
This is a particular kind of example because the reaction would be, well, that's a piddling quibble, by which it is conveyed that there is a possibility of a misunderstanding arising in the case from the elliptical nature of the question and response, meaning that we know if anyone over there actually has an implied but you in it.
Yeah.
Because we don't feel the need to state that because it's fucking obvious I'm talking to you.
Right. And he's also not saying, like, is anyone home? And she says no. And he's like, you're a liar. You know,
Right.
like, there's certain things that we can just take for granted and understand without stating. And that's like some interesting linguistic stuff.
It is interesting to think about because I'm trying to think if I know languages where you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I can't think of a language where you would say, like, is anyone home? And someone was, and you would have to necessarily say, everyone but me is
Right.
not here.
You kind of like assume German just because, like, of the pedantry.
Yeah, but
But maybe not.
it's not in there. There are some languages where there's conjugations that might make not stating the I impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think about Korean where there's particle relations, and I'm trying to think if like there's a way to answer that where you're not assuming I am talking. Like,
Sure.
But I honestly don't. I'm sure someone's going to find a language where you can't say nobody is here and not mean, but
You're also not there.
Yeah, but I am here. But if you said it would imply you weren't there too. I'm sure
Please
that
drop
language
this in the comments, people. I want to know this so bad.
Right. I'm
That's
sure
awesome.
I'm sure there's a language like that because there's like I've learned that whenever I say languages don't do something, there's like one that does. But
their laws must be amazing, like zero loopholes. Everything is just incredibly upfront. That's curious.
Or it might actually be the opposite. It might be really vague, but it might be there's no way to say it.
That's true. Yeah, they're like, what do you? All right. But again, and here we arrive at the understanding and misunderstanding and omission and all of that. What do you make of this elliptical nature of question and response? What does he mean by the elliptical nature?
The elliptical nature means like parts of the question are always left out because they're assumed. We don't need to communicate them because they're obvious.
Gotcha.
And so now I think when we get to the next section, I actually think he kind of like slightly abuses this principle. But what do I mean by that? Like if I'm talking to you and we're talking about, like what he said, I'm coming over. Are you alone?
Mm-hmm.
Or is anyone in the house? We actually know that he's asking, are you alone? And is there anyone in the house but you?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot more that's implied in that whole conversation
right.
as well.
There's a ton that's implied in that.
Mm-hmm.
English is a moderate context-dependent language. There are languages that are a lot more context-dependent. Like, think about, again, I know Korean a little bit, can speak it kind of. And one of the things I remember about Korean is like, your relationships really do define the entire way you speak. So if you translate something literally from Korean without taking the conjugations or the particle conjugation into account, it sounds really basic and like really rude to an English speaker because we do all that with like word choice.
Yeah.
They do all that with like relational conjugation. They do that in Japanese too. So
Yeah, Japanese, exactly. I was also thinking, I mean, not on that level of who you're speaking to necessarily, but relationally, um, Russian and Polish and probably other Slavic languages have like so many weird tenses and
fuck
relational
even
words.
like
It's really
Germanic
difficult.
languages other than English, because we dropped the dative tense because it got too confused when we introduced all the Latinate parts into our language. But like Old English still has dative, and
Yeah.
German has dative tense, and dative tense is the bane of my fucking existence. But because I always forget about it, and
Right.
um, it's interesting to think. I was also talking to somebody about like uh, gender stuff in other languages, and I was hearing what gender neutral language was trying to do in German.
Yeah,
And I don't mean to sound reactionary, but it really did sound both harder and almost absurd.
that's hilarious. But
So
just using sorry, neuters for everything, or I mean, because at least there are neuters in German. Like you could technically
yeah,
try to
but
reduce.
grammatical and physical gender in German is less even related than it is in Latin languages,
Mm.
because like Menschen, which is a word I've heard you're not even really supposed to use anymore, but means girl, is neuter. It's not feminine.
Yeah,
Uh, so
yeah, but that's the like, yeah, children are often in like the neuter category until like young adulthood when things
right.
start to become a little clearer. That's really funny, actually. Anyway,
Mm.
um,
but
elliptical nature.
yeah, elliptical nature. I would
Insofar, oh yeah, go ahead.
I would say English is more elliptical than a lot of other languages, though, because we don't have as many grammatical ways to signify a lot of this stuff. We
Mm-hmm.
signify it almost purely in word choice.
Yeah, that's interesting. It was
And
difficult to teach English, fun and difficult to tiny little Hebrew speakers back in the day, and like, yeah, explaining verb tenses that
you
don't
also
exist.
worked
And
in
you're like,
EL
why? In what?
and English language learning for non-native speakers.
I guess technically it was just a tutor.
Oh, I've worked in EL for a long time, and one of the most fun things is explaining people who speak Japano-Korean languages the difference between a definite and an indefinite article.
Oh God,
Like, because you think it's obvious, and it's not always.
no.
um, um, and there is no such thing in Korean.
Yeah.
They don't have articles. Everything's done with particles.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's a word conjugation issue, and you conjugate for way more things than definite and indefinite. Um, but anyway, I find it interesting because I think English is kind of maddeningly elliptical and maddeningly idiomatic, because it's also okay. I have my theory, and it's going to piss people off because people yell at me
Here we
whenever I say
go.
this. That
20
I
minutes
think
in, we're at that point.
English, in the form of what we call Middle English, probably originated as a pigeon language.
Ooh,
Uh,
curious.
that people did not actually speak at home, but was like the public language of Anglo-Saxons interacting with Norman French speakers
Okay.
and Scandinavians, and then it became a very quickly became a native language, but kind of what we would call a Creole, um,
Curious.
because if you've ever read Anglo-Saxon, I can read Anglo-Saxon. It's basically High Frisian, right? Like it's like directly related to like Dutch.
Where would I have read Anglo-Saxon? In what
Beowulf.
text? Beowulf? Yeah, I mean, we read that in like in high school in a
But you
humanities
didn't read
course
it
that
in
I
the
took.
original.
We read it exactly in the original. It was like I might even have it here still. But with the original in English like side by side. We
Okay.
did the same thing with Canterbury Tales. I can still recite the opening of Canterbury Tales in
Well,
that
the reason
language.
why I ask you is your instructor is trained on Old English, that
She's
is
like,
not
this is how I got into etymology in the first
okay.
place.
But
Yeah,
that
yeah.
may be the case because I can do it too. But like I had to take coursework on all English, and the only reason I was good at it is because I took coursework in German and Yiddish.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, we
Uh,
started picking apart like the German and the Latin and the Greek and everything. From
you get
our
a ton of French and Middle English, right?
yeah, oh
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
and also Middle English is very is I don't think we know how much Old English was regionally variant
Mm-hmm.
because we don't have as many written texts. This is a weird side note, but we do know how much Middle English is regional variant, and the transition between Old and Middle English is regionally variant. Like if you read something like Gawain and the Green Knight in its original
Mm-hmm.
untranslated form, um, and I'm pretty sure that's just a fucking pigeon language because it's not like it's there's not enough agreement on how you do anything.
Sure.
Um, but so what that means in English is that we drop a bunch of the grammatical stuff from both French and German. We just drop it.
Mm-hmm.
Gender being one of them.
Right.
Um, dative case, consistent plurals, um, consistent conjugation of to be verbs because half of them are Latin and half of them are German because
Yeah.
fuck you.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
true tenses. We actually, I mean, like, you can argue that English has 4 true tenses because they don't require helper words, and then
Okay.
like 36 or something like pseudo tenses that require helper words, which is
Amazing.
just it's absurd to think about, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it means that English is necessarily elliptical, and it's both why it's easy to learn and impossible to fucking learn all of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because our language is really forgiving if you fuck it up. Because like we don't have rules really. Like
Totally. And you're still understood in most cases.
right. Where if you fuck up Chinese, for example, and you don't know your tones, people cannot understand you.
No, no. And you might get into trouble real fast.
I've tried it. It's bad.
I
Uh,
believe you.
you know, me, I'm like, oh, sinological languages, that's nice and easy. It has really easy grammar. It doesn't even really have true tenses. All I have to say is like the verb and a time. And it's in the same order as English, and there's not that much grammatical gender. Oh my God, there's tones.
Oh,
They
yeah.
really matter. I'm
That's so
fucked,
funny.
and no one can read this. Um, so
My favorite thing about Japanese is that like negation happens at like just the very end of a sentence. Like, you're like really you're not sure where this is going into the end.
oh, that
Pretty cool.
happens in Korean too. Both
Mm-hmm.
negation and the verb happen at the very, very end of the
Yeah,
sentence.
yeah, yeah. You got to get a whole lot of stuff out of the way first. It's good for like, keeping a captive audience.
It's like in German when the sentence is long, because German has the same grammatical structure as English when it's a short sentence, but if it's a complex sentence, the verb moves to the end. It
Mm-hmm.
becomes like Japanese and Korean.
And it gets split up. It's all
Yeah,
fucked up. God damn it,
and
Germans.
and German sentences can go on for pages. Anyway, um,
We didn't even mention Welsh if we're going into that
I,
category.
that's just long ass words.
It's
Uh,
insanely long as words.
I am fascinated with Celtic languages, but I've also decided I'm not going to learn any of them because I've tried to learn Irish, and that's the easy one. And
Really?
like, yeah, and I'm like, okay, I understand that you can use our alphabet and make it make different sounds, but I'm not going to get used to what sounds this is supposed to make.
Yeah.
And the grammar is interesting. Although,
The names are hard enough from Irish language.
right,
They sound nice, but they look bizarre.
Quiva looks like
Siobhan.
Colomovin or something, and
There's always lots of L's and
like
Y's and
Shaban is like
Siobhan, Charisse.
Sorsha,
There you
um,
go.
Column, Maeve, and then you look at how you spell them, and you're like, what the
Bro,
fuck?
what the hell?
like, sorry, I know I have Irish listeners.
No,
I
you guys are
apologize.
awesome. We are better than we are. Clearly, we can't deal with any of this
Yeah.
secret code. Very cool.
Um. All right.
Insofar as one attempts to avoid ellipsis, one gets the perhaps justifiably cumbersome jargon of philosophical treatises. On the other hand, as soon as a question is raised, the understood is obviously riot understood and has to be made explicit. Now, I wasn't sure if that was a mistake or that's just like old S
I think it's old slang.
language.
I think it's
Riot understood.
Riot understood means like disorderly understanding.
Curious.
So I mean, what is interesting to me, the reason why I brought up Wittgenstein is this is like very clearly Draper going like, look, we understand philosophical language is really fucking precise and it has like clear proposition and sets and shit.
Yeah.
People don't actually talk that way. They've never talked that way. Quit pretending to talk that way. And like the second half of Wittgenstein's career is basically that.
Really?
Yeah, it's basically like,
I'm super unfamiliar.
Yeah, if you read the Blue and Brown books, it's basically like, hey, we know that like precise sets and absolute definitions, even in science and technical jargon, doesn't really exist. Quit pretending that it does, you weird analytic philosophers.
There you go.
It's the analytic way of doing that. Although, you know, it's not quite the I often consider continental philosophy that isn't Hegelian or Kantian or German idealist to be like, once we get past the rational period, to be like playing philosophy without a net. So like it's like informal poetry because it's like
that sounds about right.
Because so much of it's like, okay, I have to figure out this fucking philosopher's idiosyncratic language game before I can really move on.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to this. The limitations of Marxist formulas. I love this. I thought this was funny, but I also think this is damning in ways that I don't think Draper realizes.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. Let's dig in.
All right. This is what we now have to do with the formula, the inevitability of socialism, because all formulas are by their very nature elliptical.
In italics.
Yeah, which means what he means here is all formulas are basically in common language. They are not really scientific, which I find funny because that isn't what formula means. If you're going to call something a formula, you actually do mean you're using the technical precise thing. And I'm like, okay, Draper, I am with you in spirit here.
Yeah.
But I actually don't think when people refer to things as formulas that they think that people are using common language.
No, I mean, what about like symbolic logic and philosophy, for one thing?
Yeah, that's a formula. I mean, literally, symbolic logic is literally attempting to
formalize.
Yeah, formalize what we would consider qualitative expressions into a formal manner. One of the things that is maddening is quanta is easy to formalize. Qualia is not.
Definitely.
And also, while I would love to be an Aristotelian and pretend that quanta and qualia are fundamentally different, the fact that I can put numbers on hues and that's meaningful actually indicates that that's kind of a spectrum and not actually
hues. Is that what you said?
So if I was to label like pink to maroon, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
sure,
that is comprehensible.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, I see what you mean.
Which means,
I mean, even just like in like design, it's
right?
The hex codes and everything.
Right, which is not to say like yes, in some degrees there's arbitrary, but when I label pink to maroon in 1 through 10, I'm actually talking about intensity, meaning that I am trying to quantify something that theoretically can't be quantified, which is a color. Like for example, usually, like, but there's still a rough meaning to putting scales of intensity on. Sure. And the reason why I bring this up is there are people who are like, well, and even I do this sometimes, I'll be honest, where I'm like, one of the reasons why we can talk about universal languages with quanta is because we're literally only talking about certain kinds of things, which brackets out the experience of, I don't know, most fucking things in the universe. And this, but it's a spectrum that's still comprehensible when you overlay them. So the idea that like quanta and qualia never meet is just not true.
That's really funny. I'm just thinking of going to like my local Himalayan restaurant, and every time they ask someone, I'm always listening to the conversations there because I like to go alone, how spicy they want something from 1 to 10. There's always like a lot of kind of bartering and trying to figure out what those numbers even mean.
The numbers are arbitrary, but you do know that 1 is less intense than 10. That's what you got.
Of course, the only like intelligible kind of response in questioning this I've ever heard was someone going, "Where would you put sriracha on that scale?" This is like, clever man. You gotta use something for reference.
Although I'm just gonna like bring up the fact that the heat, what causes heat in Himalayan and Indian food, is usually not the same as what causes heat in Mexican food.
Yeah, it's not like Scoville's so much as everything else. Definitely, it's true. But like the other response from the poor waitress is always like, it's kind of relative. It depends on what you like, and again, just kind of blurring things a little bit. But I recommend a 7 if you can handle heat. Anyway.
Yeah, I can't handle heat, but I recommend not being hospitalized by your Scoville count, as I almost ended up one time.
That's insane.
All right,
people are crazy. Okay,
I ate one of those chips that like have the you can't eat it thing, and you get a bag of chips free if you did, and I ate it. That was a bad idea.
I know people who have gotten ulcers from that. Absolutely.
I didn't get an ulcer. I got the most severe stomach cramps I ever had in my life, and thought I had to go to the hospital for about 5 minutes.
Insane.
All right.
Yeah. No. What is it?
Okay. All right. All formulas are by their nature inevitable. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
A formula is an attempt to. Well, this is kind of true, actually. A formula. The thing is, though, I'm going to say this. This is an equivocation of what we mean by elliptical.
I'm going to mute myself while you read this. Go ahead. My cat's having an elliptical conversation with herself about the cupboard.
A formula is an attempt to reduce a more or less extensive group of facts to shorter generalizations. But the generalizations can never be completely equivalent to the facts which it generalizes. Its value lies in that it can usually be substituted and that it usually works in such substitutions, but the process of generalization requires one to leave out part of the data. All generalizations, all formulas can only have relative validity. The old saw, all generalizations are false, including this one, has its counterpart in the all Marxist formulations are wrong, including this one.
Okay, now we got a lot to dig in there, but it's impossible not to start with that last comment, which is so intense. All Marxist formulas are wrong, including this one, where he's playing on the old saw, which I looked up and is attributed to Mark Twain about generalizations being wrong. And it sounds very similar to the antinomy of the liar's paradox, right?
Actually, but what it actually is the map is not the territory. All right. So let me explain this. The more accurate a map is, the more like it would be to the topographical landscape of which it is representing. If it is completely accurate, it is basically just the world. And which it has no
then
use.
It won't be a representation. It would be like not an analog, the thing itself.
It's not a but by being the thing itself, or just even representing the thing itself exactly, it doesn't have any use.
Curious.
Right. I mean, could you, if your map had everything in your room in it and could you actually follow it in a way to give you directions?
Sure. That's really curious and interesting. But I had another thought as well when he was talking about generalizations and formulas that require us to leave out parts of data. Is this true for like chemical formulas? Those seem on like the most molecular level to be pretty inclusive.
So here's the thing. You are right to a degree.
Okay.
Like even chemical formulas are, for example, bracket out stuff like atomic decay. They're not dealing with that. But one thing we have to think about here is levels of complexity.
Right.
Molecules are a very low level of complexity. So it is easier to have a formulaic statement or an abstraction that's going to be universally true. Like this many electrons is going to produce this kind of molecule. This kind of molecule mixed with this kind of molecule is going to make this kind of thing. Right? But And this is why baking's so precise and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about it in other ways, though, once you scale up the matters of complexity, this gets really messy all the time. And like a field of study, for example, like in the different sciences, is going to be usually separated by the level of complexity. The reason why we always think of physics as like the hard science is because it's the least complex. And by that, I don't mean it's not complex to learn. It absolutely fucking is. I mean that like it's about the most basic shit in the universe.
Right.
You're not dealing with levels of interaction. Whereas you think about like human psychology, someone could say, well, all human psychology is just physics, which is like, okay, superficially true in that the brain is a physical thing which exists with
Neurons and
molecules and
synapses.
well, not even like neurons and synapses exist with molecules made out of this, that, or the other.
Sure.
Like
works just like electricity and
yeah, you're even when you talk about neurons and synapses, you're like 5 orders up.
Yeah.
Right. But the thing is, talking about psychology at the level of physics is useless because there's so many levels of complexity above that, synapses, etc. Arguably, even the reduction to neurology may be misleading because it's a reduction to part of the psychology, not all of the psychology. This has been a pretty big debate when we're learning stuff like, way the brain lights up after you do stuff. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So in this sense, yes. What I was thinking at the beginning, though, his talks about elliptical language in that last paragraph are about common language.
Yeah. Formulas are not common language.
Yeah. His talks here, when you realize what he's doing, are about symbolic formalization.
Right.
Because it is symbolic, just like the map is not the territory. My point is that's an equivocation. So he's like, what we mean by elliptical and common language, and what we mean by elliptical, like, oh, we don't expect the symbol to actually convey everything, is different. And yet when we get to the point about formulas in a minute, both things are being implicated, and that's a trick. That's actually a logical trick.
It's got the semiotics and like
both both common language and semiotics are being invoked as if he's talking about the same thing through the elliptical nature. But if we think about what's being cut out, it's very different. What we're cutting out of formalizations is stuff that we don't think is essential to what we're talking about. Okay, that's I guess that is similar. But the why we're cutting it out is not because it's obvious, but because if we include it, we can't actually make the statement about this particular process.
Right. Also, you can't like make a placeholder for unknown variables that are unknown to you as well in the human subjective sense.
Right. But when he's talking about like common language equivocations, that's stuff we don't mention because it's obvious or because we have idiomatic representations for it, etc. That is not the same as cutting it out in a formula. They are related.
No, it would still have to be in that formula.
Right. They are related because of the nature of symbolic representation. Yeah. But this is a different, you're cutting stuff out for different reasons. And honestly, in common everyday language, we cut stuff out because we understand them so thoroughly that we don't need to mention them. And thus, if people don't understand them, if they're reading our language, they'll be confused. Whereas when you're cutting out for a formula, you're cutting out strategically for clarity, not because you understand the things that you're cutting out, but because if you included them, they would make this an incomprehensible mess. Like if we were thinking about talking about physics in terms of psychology, like if you try to flip that like around, and people do, and it's all, when I say people do, it's like think about all the number of people who like, if I think about it as the what the bleep do we know problem, where people are like trying to mix in some like symbolic perception, meanings of words, and like quantum entanglement and shit.
Interesting.
And so what they're doing there is they are conflating between levels of abstraction, and basically the smaller level can have an implication for the larger one. The larger one may actually have an implication for the smaller one, but what you can't do is go arbitrarily back and forth between the two as if they were the same.
Interesting.
Like, okay, so people go, well, it's obvious how the smaller level affects the larger one, but let's talk about how the larger one affects the smaller one. My chemical
Romance
may change because of what I eat.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so I'm actually affecting my chemistry and thus my molecular biology by stuff that's affected on a higher level, like me as a being eating.
Right. What about also, time spent outside in a dry
Right.
or a wet environment or sunshine or
But what I probably can't do is assume that my subjective perception in my brain, which is one process, has an effect on quantum entanglement, which is another process, directly. Thus, psychicness is real.
Right.
There's confusions about like the mechanisms there, and you're basically arbitrarily going back and forth between higher and lower orders of description.
Interesting. Okay.
Anyway,
sorry that you can't actually manifest people. Keep trying though.
Yeah.
You never know.
Good job. So I mean, what he says about formulas is true.
Mm-hmm.
Like mathematical formulas bracket out qualities, like we were talking about that. They bracket out, like, we're not worried about the apple's redness versus the apple's greenness if we're counting one apple plus another apple. Although we are worried about it if we're counting one green apple and one red apple.
Totally.
Right. All right.
I really want this on a t-shirt though. I think if you're ever going to make Varn vlog merch, all Marxist formulas are wrong, including this one, would be like the most
This is the most provocative.
Perfectly contrarian. Yeah.
I'm a Marxist because I think it's all bullshit. No, all right. Any formula is an attempt to tie up reality in a bundle and put a label on it. I think that's true. That's what the entire field of semiotics is about.
Sure.
And it's interesting because semiotics, as we understand, it's really developing at the same time as this. So he doesn't really yeah, there's like Caesarean linguistics and early linguistics and pragmatics and the beginnings of semiotics. Pragmatics goes all the way back to pragmatism and Charles Sanders' Peirce. But semiotics is where you kind of underthink it. It's like it actually begins in the 30s and 40s, so it's like contemporaneous to this.
Okay. All right.
All right. The infinite complexity of so he does try to deal with complexity. Infinite complexity of reality does not lend itself to this. This is the dilemma of the natural scientist, no less than that of the social scientist. Both. This got to be an error because that's a weird use of double.
Right. He's got
both have to dissect the living organism and others who study it. I'm actually not sure that's true. That's a matter.
That's what I was thinking too. And I was like, I don't know, maybe my brain's all fucked up, but I can imagine.
Like, I actually don't have to dissect an economy to study it. We didn't kill the economy to look at it. All right. As soon as you dissect it, you are no longer studying a living organism. Thank you, vivisectionist.
Yeah.
It has yet to be done. Ha.
Guess what? Sorry, Draper,
we figured out X-ray technology. Now this is no longer true. The scientist must understand that much or most of the time he is studying a phenomena abstracted out of context. And that, necessary as this step is, it is not the end of his investigation, but the beginning of a dialectical understanding of the phenomenon and their dynamic interrelations. Formulas are dead pieces of living reality.
I like that line anyway.
Just as scientific laboratory may be full of useful jars filled with organs of pickled and formaldehyde, so Marxist literature is full of very useful formulas.
Pickled and formaldehyde.
So, again, I'm gonna be the logician here and just say, like, this is true, kind of.
Yeah.
But not entirely true. As an argument, the weakest forms of argument are always analogous.
Mm-hmm.
Because
but it is a nice flourish. Yeah. You have to give him that.
It's well written. It's a good rhetoric.
Definitely.
And I guess I get his point. Like, there are many useful formulas. Don't take them too seriously because they're abstracted from a context. The context is constantly changing.
Sure.
So we can't necessarily apply the formula that worked in one case and the formula in another, which I think is true and actually point Marx explicitly makes. But it also you actually do have to go, then why do you have these fucking formulas all the time if all you're really deducing is this is the formula in this context at this time?
Well, that's kind of like the underlying point that Draper is making here without stating explicitly, I think, is a lot of it. You know, if all of this goes back into understanding the coexistence of inevitable, of historical alternatives and formulas that were formulated a long time ago, and then watching how history actually unfolds and saying, well, this thing could happen or that thing could happen. Maybe this formula is not so airtight as we first thought.
And we're going to get into that with like Marxist rules, and then I'm going to bring up that like this is one of the few points where I think George Orwell actually has a point.
Uh-oh.
All right. And this one requires me explaining history. But anyway.
Yeah, well, now we're going to get into some cool historical.
To take one example, when 100 would not be too much for the re-education of muscle-bound Marxists.
That's such a strange, there's another turn of phrase, because I keep hearing to blank by half as like an idiom recently, but where 100 would not be too much.
Yeah, it's basically, these people are morons.
That's right, understood. Yes, these muscle-bound Marxists.
I know it's funny calling them muscle-bound, but anyway.
I love this, yeah.
Lenin's writings during the 1917 hammered away at the socialists who became defensists under Kerensky. I'm going to asterisk this. Defensists here does not mean Soviet defensists. It means defensists of Kerensky maintaining entry into World War I.
Yeah, let's get into that in a bit.
All right. With the formula, the character of the class in power determines the character of the war. The criterion is, first of all, which class is in power and which class continues to rule. This is from Lenin. This is a generalization from a certain number of facts about the nature of the capitalist state and imperialism. But when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, this formula stood a small section of Trotskyist movements on its ear. The party and Trotsky came out in favor of military defense and material support, not political support. This is a distinction that's made in Trotskyism all the time that drives people up the wall.
Material versus political.
To the loyalist government as raising a progressive war. So you are allowed to support the government, but you're not allowed to politically endorse them. So that's political support versus material support. Material support versus political support. What's
the differentiation then between
the political support means that we would recognize the legitimacy of the government. Material support means, no, we're going to help them fight this because their enemies are worse, but we don't actually recognize their legitimacy ultimately, like we're willing to.
What does recognize legitimacy mean in like in a material sense? Because that sounds rather.
It means you'll be willing.
Idealistic.
No, I mean actually, it's very realistic. It means you'll be willing to enter in a parliamentary government with them.
I see. Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense.
So like you got to assume that these are socialists also in Spain, not just outside of Spain.
Gotcha.
So okay. And by the way, this is one of the few times where Trotskyist and anarchist and Marxist, Leninist, aka Stalinist, no Maoist yet, we're actually all in agreement.
That's why people are so romantic about the Spanish Civil War, huh?
Right. When anarchists talk about the Spanish Civil War, it makes it sound like the anarchists were the people actually running the fucking country, which they weren't.
I mean, come on. That's a cute combination of words.
They did actually run their own, like they ran regions of the country legitimately.
And yeah, syndicalism and all of that, yeah.
Yeah, that was real, but like the Arañez government was a Republican government and a capitalist government.
Azania?
Yeah, Azania is not Arañez.
Azania.
Sorry, I made him the spider.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
and I
funny.
think it's funny because we don't hear that much about the Azanias government. We hear a lot more about like the CNT um, and the
Wait, read this little like quote and then get back into that, because I know so little about the Spanish Civil War and I would love to understand, but I think this is important. Like,
Well, this is also going to get weird because the Trotskyists were defensists in World War II,
yeah.
but they did not support material support to the Soviet Union during World War II, which is why so many MLs call them fascist sympathizers, because they actually said we should shut the war out.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah.
uh,
Let's do Kerensky and Azanias here.
but so Kerensky, um, I mean, this is a difference in time.
Yeah.
And the Spanish Civil War is much more contemporary
Yeah,
to
uh-huh.
Draper's writing than Kerensky. Although, I mean, Kerensky is really only literally 30 years ago at this point, so it's just a generation back. So let's talk about the Kerensky government. Um, the Kerensky government was the government of the February Revolution of 1917.
Yes.
uh, Kerensky is kind of more aligned with the cadets. If you think about the factions in the Russian Revolution who are not at this point whites, which means supporters of the Tsar state, you have the social revolutionaries, which are on the spectrum of between radical social democrats and Marxists to anarchists to brigands, depending on who you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, the cadets who are liberals, like capitalist liberals, and the Narodniks who are populists.
Right. And I think Kerensky was a Narodnik, right?
Kerensky was a Narodnik who was sympathetic to the cadets.
Okay. So
Uh,
they were like social democrat, like agrarian socialists, as far as I could tell.
right. He was a leader of the Social Democratic uh, Trevovic Party, which is a
Mm-hmm.
party we hardly ever talk about.
Right. I've not
Um,
heard of them.
they were a breakaway from the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which I think is what we would call uh, the United Social Democrats, sort
Yeah.
of.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and these like the Social Revolutionary Party is where the Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, the SRs, obviously. Well, actually, no. The Mensheviks and Bolsheviks come out of the Social Democrats. The Social Revolutionary Party becomes the SRs. They
Okay.
they are a mixture of Narodnism, agrarian socialism, uh, etc.
And narod is like folk, people
Right.
in Russian.
Right. And the SRs, however, weren't all Narodniks either, so that's why we talk about like the Narodniks as separate from the Social Revolutionaries.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but a lot of them just joined the Bolsheviks too. And they were broadly speaking, um, the Bolsheviks were more popular in the cities. The Narodniks were more popular in the countrysides. And in 1921, the social revolutionaries uh, really kind of did have a pretty large representation in the Duma, which created a problem for the Bolsheviks. Um, and that's why the Duma was disbanded. So,
Mm-hmm.
but anyway, so Kerensky comes out of the sort of social revolutionary, but he's sort of from what we might see as their Mensheviks. The Trudovics are kind of like the Mensheviks are like the less revolutionary faction of
Yeah.
that group. He becomes more and more aligned with the cadets and was so worried about being cooed by liberal factions more sympathetic to the whites that he kept on making more and more concessions to them. Furthermore, the whole February Revolution was justified in breaking out of World War One, but Kerensky was totally afraid that if he actually backed out, that they would be invaded by the Allies.
Right. That's he was like a kind of like a precondition by
Right.
the greater powers. He didn't have much say in that, as far as I could tell.
But the government was incredibly weak.
Hmm.
There were a lot of socialists who defended Kerensky, even some people that were adjacent to Bolsheviks. But Lenin said, no, you can't defend Kerensky because even if he is a Narodnik and an agrarian socialist, he is supporting a capitalist state.
Right. Can I read a funny little quote? I asked Kuba about Kerensky. He has great knowledge about all of these types. He said that he had read a biography about him. I quote, he said it was the head of post-Tsarist provisional government. Like an Italian technocrat PM, a well-meaning liberal plucked from polite society to administer a fanciful agenda favored by bourgeois interests and foreign powers with no base of his own or understanding of the political environment. A classic placeholder. I had to share that.
Yeah, well, basically, you could kind of think of him as a right-wing social democrat who is trying to appease capitalist interest, who is also, he doesn't have a strong social base. He's from the intellectia. He's weak all around. And one of the things about the Bolshevik Revolution, whether or not you want to call it a coup, and I know a lot of people who listen to me don't. I have a few people who do. It's very complicated because if it was a coup, it was a coup that people called for, like that all kinds of people called for, because they were afraid that if the Bolsheviks didn't do it, then the White Army or somebody sympathetic to the White Army would, because Kerensky wasn't powerful enough to hold the government together.
That's interesting, even just to consider, like, can you really have coups within revolutionary periods where everything's just kind of a little bit up in the air? The establishment isn't so settled.
Right.
My cat says no.
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, we do talk about the October Revolution as a different revolution. Interestingly, if you look at like the fighting in the revolution, there's more fighting in February than in October. And the real fighting after October doesn't come in 1917. It comes in the Civil War in 1921. Like, because the October Revolution is not bloodless, but it's not that bloody.
Sure.
The Civil War is devastating.
Yeah.
And basically Kerensky, goes to the United States, lives out, becomes a kind of anti-Bolshevik liberal, and
a professor, works with the Hoover Institute, I believe. But this is such an I mean, how many people within this article alone have not made a similar turn? We just spoke about Sidney Hook beforehand. Burnham came up, I believe, at a certain point. Like,
right. Well, a whole lot of these people end up conservatives. People go, "Oh, it's Trotskyist." I'm like, no, it's like most of the early 20th century people who weren't in the Bolshevik government.
Yeah,
they either end up conservatives or they end up dead. So, to get into this now, the Spanish Civil
lessons
War,
from history.
Spanish Civil War is an even more complicated event, and arguably is itself a kind of civil war after a revolution. All right, Spanish Civil War lasts from 1936 to 1939.
Mm-hmm.
It is a war between the Republicans and nationalists, although, like I said, if you were to listen to people, it would sound like it was a war between the anarchists and the fascists. And I'm going to actually go over the factions real fast. So the Republicans were a popular front. Now, normally Trotskyists don't support popular fronts. That's why there's that little thing in there about the Trotskyists agreed to this, which breaks their no popular front policy. But they agreed.
In short, what is a popular front for people listening who don't know?
Oh man, I got to go into the difference between popular fronts and united fronts. All right. So Popular Front is this idea that you will support progressive bourgeois governments in coalitions that can enter the government. United fronts are the idea, and there's united fronts from above and below, and there's actually different tiers of united frontism, but united frontism is the policy of the Bolsheviks under Lenin. Trotsky kind of has his own form of it. I know that they say it's the same as Lenin's, but it's kind of not. And United Front says, look, you can't enter a government with these people. It's actually also the same stance as the Second International before they really entered the government in the 1920s. You can't enter a government with bourgeois parties, but you can support them if they're fighting worse bourgeois parties or reactionary parties outright. Popular Front says you can support their government and you can enter government coalitions with them. That's the difference. Popular fronts were opposed by the Soviet Union. Actually, so were united fronts from above too, until 1936. In 1936, they dropped what we now call third periodism and allow people to enter popular fronts with social democrats, anarchists, and other groups.
Mm-hmm.
So the Soviet Union from 1929 to 1936 had a you don't mix with anybody, but they're communist rule basically.
And then suddenly the Spanish Civil War.
Right, they flipped it because of the threat of fascists. However, they also, in this same time period, make more concessions to fascists in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is a whole different thing. But the other thing is when we talk about this, the enemies of the government, the nationalists were not all fascists. There were definitely fascists amongst them.
Sure.
They were also monarchists, traditionalists, various forms of conservatives, and other people who were running an unelected military junta.
Spain still has a monarchy, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the monarchies, the people who, when Franco died, actually restored democracy. It's very strange. Spain was a big loss. But some of the Trotskyists actually were confused by Trotsky's stance on this because the Second Spanish Republic was a provisional government backed by a constitution that was reformist, but more or less just modernist reformist and liberal. It was not anarchist, etc., although it did allow for the anarchists and stuff to have power in certain regions and to manifest that power in like syndicates and relative autonomy.
Okay.
And I bring that up because, like I said, when leftists talk about the Spanish Civil War, they tend to think it's fucking anarchists and Trotskyists fighting against fascists, and then also the Stalinists betray them. And it's way more complicated than that. Although the betrayal kind of is there. What Draper's pointing out is like he's saying that Trotsky was right to support the Spanish Civil War, but you can't justify it off of the same line Lenin does. And what he's saying is it's because the relevant variables are different in each case.
Yes.
My point is, then why the fuck did you pretend that you have a rule? Because you don't.
Yeah, it's not just about capitalism and imperialism in this case here. That's curious. Isn't this like the moment that you've got to bring Orwell up again?
Right. Well, Orwell says that a lot of Marxist formulas, and Orwell at this time still considers himself a Marxist. All right.
Mm-hmm.
But that a lot of Marxist formulas are just brought up to justify whatever the fuck you want to do. Like there is not actually an undergirding principle or law behind them. They are like you were just twisting and turning in the wind and citing formulas. And I hate to say it, but this argument seems like a justification for that.
Interesting.
Because it doesn't actually okay, well, I'll read the whole pigeon because we haven't gotten into this.
Yeah.
All right.
What? From there, right?
Yeah. What? But this isn't a capitalist class in power and a loyalist government of Azania. Well, doesn't the capitalist class continue to rule? The Lenin quotations were exhibited. We countered in essence with another, but wider formula of Lenin's: war is a continuation of politics by other means. And the character of the war is determined by the character of the politics of which it is a continuation. All right, so here's the problem. Marxists talk about class politics, but what they mean by that is a floating signifier.
Uh-oh. Oh my God, shut it down.
Right. 99 times out of 100, in the case of capitalist imperialist states, the politics from which their war flows is capitalist imperialism. In Spain, we analyze the correctness of events and determine that the politics from which
concreteness. Sorry. In Spain, we analyze the concreteness of events.
The events and determined that the politics from which the loyalist war flowed was primarily defense against fascism. The sectarians could never understand how it was possible for Trotsky to go behind a formula committed to paper by Lenin. And I go, yeah, but the thing is, it actually doesn't make, like, what you're saying there is like, well, the politics is understood by the class character of the politics, and in one case it's the expansion of capitalist imperialism, in the other case it's defense against fascism. And I guess he's like, right, but that actually means that you what you have is a different rule from either formula stated.
Sure.
Right. And you are picking, you're picking a different formula by Lenin to justify Trotsky doing something that tactically I think is supportable and smart, but ultimately also is in contradiction to what Lenin said, specifically in the case of Kerensky.
Right. It sounds more like a flow chart. If A, if B, then it does a set of formulas that work
together. Ad hoc rationalizations of which you kind of pick, and because you can see this, like, this gets absurd now,
mm-hmm.
where we start arguing about like wars where there are literally not even a faction of any group that even claims to be a Marxist group, and yet we're trying to pick which side Marx would support, and this, that, and the other.
Sounds weirdly familiar, no?
Yeah. And then we talk about the class nature of the war, what is capitalist imperialism, and then what you start realizing is like these categories don't actually explain much, and people are bending them to justify what they already believe.
Yeah.
It's not really, the Marxism is not a guiding principle here. And I mean, in the case of the Spanish Civil War, you what you really have is like you have a reactionary junta fighting an elected government. That elected government is like left capitalist, but it does have space for socialist in it. But it actually does make hay of like a lot of people's categories. And one of the things that you notice here is like one of the how they justify this is we're giving material support but not political support.
Yeah.
Trotsky has come up with all these like Marxists, Leninists just don't give a shit about maintaining their formulas. They'll just drop them and be like, oh, that was just wrong. We clearly learned from history, blah, 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 dialectics. Now we just reverse it.
But this is not revisionism. This is progress. Yes.
What Trotskyists tend to do is like, aha, I'm going to complicate this category so I can say we're maintaining this by limiting what we do. So we're maintaining the United Front by saying, okay, we're going to fight with the Popular Front, but we're not really part of it because we're not giving political support.
Right. That's like, I love that turn of phrase. They're widening a formula. Like, what is now? Is it supposed to generalize more about a bigger thing? That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
I love it. Curious, very curious.
Every formula is above every formula is the Marxist method. I guess the problem is no one ever fucking says what the Marxist method is.
Well,
a formula takes from the meaning and is tested in every application of it. Every formula involves in some exaggeration of an aspect of the truth, which is made bigger than life in order to emphasize it.
Hegel does that, no?
Yeah. One cannot avoid using formulas, but one can avoid making them in the fetishes. This is his argument for why sectarians are stupid, basically.
Yeah.
Anything else is an abandonment of the dialectical materialism, although we're not defining that here. Whether or not it is accompanied out loud by outcries of love and faith for the first victims of the pseudo-Marxist dogmatism. It is not really paradoxical to note that the aspects of Marxism which have been most frequently turned into dogmatic, pickled in formaldehyde is dialectical materialism itself. Okay, but this is funny because this is the one thing he's not defining.
No, and we're gonna end this section today, but I think it's safe to say that he does not go on to define that in the next section, historic inevitability of socialism. Either.
Right. And so
it's just if you know, you know, and if you don't, you're probably doing it wrong.
I mean, this is the thing, though. Like, what we mean by dialectical materialism versus, say, historical materialism. Yes, there's books on that. Stalin wrote a book on it. Deitzen wrote a book. Deitzen wrote a book on it. Marx and Engels don't actually use the term. The term is in Engels, but it's put in English, but it's put there by an editor. It's not put there by Engels himself.
Yeah, we brought that up last time, I think.
Yeah, but it came up in Saito.
Uh-huh.
I actually do think that Marx and Engels do believe something like historical materialism, and that they do think there's like, roughly speaking, terms. But I do know that recently a lot of our friends, such as like my friend Daniel Tutt, really are beginning to like double down on old, like Marxism as Marxist is stagist and he never gave it up, blah blah blah. And I'm like, there's evidence that he at least complicated it.
When did this come up? That's interesting. Was that in a
It's in the debate around Saito and John Bellamy Foster.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Because John Bellamy Foster is indirectly arguing with Saito by talking about how cool Lenin Engels is. And yeah, that's going to be...
I think, yeah, there's a really interesting lecture by Saito where he speaks a little bit about Engels being kind of secondary and all of his considerations on Marxism. So,
for patrons, you can hear us discuss Saito in Karl Marx's Ecosocialism book behind the paywall. We are on our also fourth.
Yep. We're about to do the fourth one. He specifically makes a claim against a formulation of Engels, which is rather Promethean with regards to the way that you can just get like resources ad infinitum from the soil. He says that's not something that Marx says. If you read in the Mega, volume 2 and 4, in his economic manuscripts for volume 3 of Capital. But that's all I'll say about that. Join the Patreon to hear more. Fascinating conversation. Really good read.
And once we finish that, however long that takes, but it is kind of interesting that we've gone through like 100 pages of that book, which is more dense than this. Faster than we've gone through 6 pages of this Draper article.
I keep saying this, but I'm reading it on Marxist.org, so I have this like wonderful kind of experience of it being just like a flowing scroll. And if you look at the page where we're at right now, we're definitely halfway.
Yeah.
I think I've said that like 3 times, but
no, we're definitely.
It looks like we're halfway.
We're definitely halfway. I was actually counting physical papers from printing it out. We're halfway.
Yeah. I think also Saito really, really, really goes to lengths to make a point, illustrate it, kind of contrast it against other claims, and then point out exactly where he's basing this on, and then recontextualize everything. Yeah, so it takes longer to say a little bit less.
I think that book is more academic, less polemical.
Yeah.
It's also written in the second language of a Japanese speaker writing in German and translated into English.
Amazing.
So like the fact is it's readable as it is kind of actually amazing.
It is incredible.
But it is not, you don't have as many zingers as you do with Draper for sure.
No, they are there. And and if you want to hear them, then it was part 3 in our conversation where Varn has at least like 6 like fuck you this school and fuck you that sect and like mic drop here and there. And yeah, he's funny. He's actually a really funny guy. I've listened to a lot of Saito lectures now. and he's a
How's
funny
his
dude.
English?
Great. It's just like slightly difficult to understand sometimes. Like before I started reading the book, I listened to the lecture that I mentioned. I believe it was like the Lukács like memorial lecture that he gave in this part. If you look it up, you'll find that on Marx and ecology. And he kept saying Justus von Liebig. And I was like, who is Libby? I was looking up like Justice von Libby, but it's like it's Liebig, and in German it's spelled Liebig. So there's some confusion in certain parts, but he's pretty easy to understand. It just comes down to pronunciation sometimes. And in German, which is German is like actually fluent, and mine is not. Anyway,
All right.
cool guy.
And with that,